Itō Noe was born on January 21, 1895, near the city of Fukuoka on Kyushu, Japan. While she'd often be characterized as a bit of a country girl, she was far from a peasant, instead coming from the landed aristocracy. She attended Ueno Girls' High School in Tokyo, where she developed a love of literature, and was exposed to texts and ideas from Japanese and Western writers alike. At this time, she began to take an interest in progressive politics, particularly the writings of feminist and anarchist thinkers. At age 15, Noe was told that if she wanted to continue her education, she would have to enter an arranged marriage. As a free-spirited and progressive young woman, Noe obviously wasn't satisfied with this arrangement, and began seeking a way out as soon as she returned to school. At this point, she was probably already planning on never coming home. However, family circumstances forced her to do so immediately after her graduation in March 1912. Before she left, however, she received a confession of love from Tsuji Jun, her English teacher who was 11 years her senior. Anyway, at home she was married to the man her parents had selected for her, but only 9 days after the wedding, she ran away, headed back to Tokyo. There she moved in with Tsuji Jun, who she would live with for around a year before officially divorcing her arranged husband. They would have 2 sons, and eventually she would marry him, though incidentally only toward the end of their relationship. Throughout her life, Noe would refer to this marriage as her first, dismissing the legitimacy of the arranged one. Tsuji would be a major influence on Noe's ideology. He followed his own model of individualist anarchism, inspired by the works of philosophers like Friedrich Nietzsche and especially Max Stirner. Stirner's philosophy, often called egoist anarchism, revolves around the idea that commonly accepted social institutions such as the state, law, property rights, morals, and society itself are all spooks, or mental constructs, and calls for the rejection of such institutions in favor of a collective of egoists, operating on the principle of free association. Tsuji's own interpretation of this philosophy also emphasized a separation from society in order to cultivate the individual. While Noe didn't entirely agree with this, and would eventually find a political identity better suited to her own ideals, as a young woman escaping an economically motivated marriage arranged by her parents, Tsuji's notion of individualism appealed to her, and her early writings bear a clear influence from Stirner. Tsuji also likely helped Noe to find her greatest political influence, the American Anarchist Emma Goldman, whose essay Marriage and Love was translated under Noe's name in 1914, though she likely had help from Tsuji on account of her self-described inadequate English skills. When Noe moved in with Tsuji, he was out of work on account of being fired for starting a relationship with a student. Yeah, that tracks. He was unable to find a new job, so Noe had to do most of the heavy lifting to support the family. While in school, she had met with Hiratsuka Raicho, the owner of the recently founded feminist art and culture magazine Seito, or Blue Stocking, and become a contributor to the magazine at only 17 years old. In 1915, Noe joined the Seito Sha, or Blue Stocking Society, becoming more heavily involved in producing the magazine, and she would ultimately serve as Seito's last editor-in-chief, from 1915 to 1916, when the magazine shut down due to the government banning its distribution. As editor-in-chief, Noe fostered an inclusive attitude toward diverse viewpoints from different women, including controversial viewpoints about abortion, prostitution, free love, and motherhood. This would also lead to many issues of the magazine being banned by the censorious Japanese government, who didn't want women getting too many ideas about changing society. During her time at Seito, Noe wrote a number of essays on various issues of women's rights. She was one of the most outspoken and audacious writers at Seito, not shying away from attacks on public figures and voicing controversial opinions. From 1915 to 1916, she also engaged in a drawn-out written debate with fellow Seito contributor Yamakawa Kikue over licensed prostitution, with Noe arguing that it was a financially necessary practice which fell under a woman's right to bodily autonomy, in line with her stance on abortion. While she doesn't seem to have held much against Yamakawa, a fellow radical who simply took a Marxist approach rather than an anarchist one, Noe held particular disdain for bourgeois women who participated in Christian-inspired reform movements against prostitution, which she labeled arrogant, narrow-minded, half-baked Japanese women's public service activities. As you may have gathered from my mention of the end of their relationship, things didn't go entirely smoothly for Noe after she moved in with Tsuji. In addition to having ideological disagreements, and difficulties getting on with his mother, Noe's trust was broken when she discovered that Tsuji had had an affair with her own cousin when she had come to stay with them for a time. However, the factor that Noe herself would place the primary blame on for souring her relationship was marriage itself. Here, she likely drew from the work by Emma Goldman she was credited with translating. Marriage is primarily an economic arrangement, an insurance pact. It differs from the ordinary life insurance agreement only in that it is more binding, more exacting. Its returns are insignificantly small compared with the investment. In taking out an insurance policy, one pays for it in dollars and cents, always at liberty to discontinue payments. If, however, woman's premium is her husband, she pays for it with her name, her privacy, her self-respect, her very life, until death doth part. Moreover, the marriage insurance condemns her to lifelong dependency, to parasitism, to complete uselessness, individual as well as social. Just as she and Tsuji were growing apart, Noe came into contact with someone who better matched her activist spirit. In 1914, Noe first befriended the prominent Japanese anarchist Osugi Sakai. Sakai had arguably become the most prominent anarchist figure in the country following the high treason incident, which you can find out about in my video on Kano Sugako here. Because, having already been in prison at the time of the event, he had not been implicated as most other prominent anarchists were. While other socialist and anarchist thinkers tended to lay low to avoid political persecution following the incident, Sakai had not, going right back to publishing leftist works after his release from prison. He and Noe had come into contact a few times through their overlapping social circles, with Noe's translation of Goldman making a good impression on him, but it was only after being introduced by a mutual contact at Tsuji's home that they became friends. In 1915, Noe and Sakai began a public correspondence, in which they discussed topics such as the meaning of chastity and the notion of free love. Sakai had more than a passing interest in the topic. He was a major proponent of free love, and already living it out, being romantically involved with both his legal wife, Hori Yasuko, and with feminist journalist Kamichika Ichiko. Noe was apparently on board. Within a year, they were romantically involved, which came with a whole lot of controversy. See, on one hand, from the outside it really looked like Noe was just leaving her husband and children for another man, rather than leaving a relationship which had long since fallen apart in favor of a healthier one. And, on the other hand, was the love quadrangle situation. While Sakai's wife and first mistress both agreed to accept his non-monogamy at first, they weren't as comfortable with it as he was, and the three women would have a tense relationship. This culminated when Kamichika Ichiko, becoming intensely jealous of Noe, stabbed Sakai in the neck, in what would be called the Hayama Hikage Chaya scandal, after the tea house where it took place. Luckily, Sakai survived the incident, but many of his relationships wouldn't. In December of 1916, while he was in the hospital recovering from his wounds, his wife divorced him, and many of his colleagues broke with Sakai out of sympathy with her, including his publishing partner, Arahata Kanson. Meanwhile, Noe would be blamed for breaking up two marriages, both her own and Sakai's. After the incident, Noe and Sakai only became closer. They would ultimately have 4 kids together, but in accordance with their principles, never married. Noe became Sakai's new publishing partner, and they went to work writing essays and short stories to push for their ideals. Along the way, Noe also did her fair share of defending her reputation, writing essays and autobiographical stories which illustrated how her relationship with Tsuji was already falling apart a year before she began a relationship with Sakai. Throughout her career, Noe had produced a number of short stories in the genre of shosetsu, or autobiographical fiction, which was popular in Japan at the time. Essentially, these were stories taken from the lives of the authors, but told in literary prose, with certain details changed, and with names changed or rendered only as initials. While working at Seito, Noe had written a number of these stories, using her own experiences to create tales condemning the injustices women faced. Now she dedicated several stories to the difficulties she'd experienced in her relationship with Tsuji, tying in social themes she found relevant. In one telling example from 1918, The Reputation of a Beggar, Noe tells the story of Toshiko, a clear analog for herself who works as an editor for a magazine, and contemplates leaving her husband as she struggles to balance reading and studying while living with her husband, his sister, and their mother, all while trying to raise an infant. Most of all, the bullying of her mother-in-law adds stress to everything. Toshiko experiences a turning point when she discovers Emma Goldman, in whom she finds a role model who represents both a struggle for individual freedom and the desire to help the disadvantaged. While the ending of the story leaves Toshiko still undecided on her next course of action, to an audience familiar with Noe's own story, the next step would have been clear. As such, the story serves to justify Noe's decision to leave Tsuji, while giving us insight into the high regard in which she held Emma Goldman. Another story written the same year gives us further insights into Noe's political journey. This story, Turning Point, similarly represents the stifling influence of marriage on the protagonist. It begins with 2 protagonists visiting the village of Yanaka, north of Tokyo. This village had been subject to intense flooding and exposure to toxic chemicals from a nearby copper mine, which encouraged Japan's first mass environmental movement. From Sakai's writings, it's clear that the 2 protagonists are stand-ins for he and Noe, who made this actual visit to the village early in their friendship. The story then flashes back to years earlier, when the protagonist was married to a man called T. Wow, real subtle, Noe. Upon reading about the village, she is horrified, but T brushes it off, calling the villagers who stay spineless and weak, and arguing that it's worthless to think about injustice because what it comes down to is that everybody needs to develop his or her own awareness. While Noe's stand-in is unable to argue, she intuitively feels that his logic is cruel. The story then describes her discovery of Emma Goldman sometime later, and how reading this and political literature from the Sakai stand-in's newspaper motivated her to dismiss her husband and travel to the village. The story ends on a somber note, as Noe and Sakai's stand-ins find the villagers resigned to their suffering, but it concludes that, in order to live, one has to fight. At the same time, there must be a way to fight on behalf of those who suffer even more than oneself. While Sakai had become cynical about social activism before he met Noe, he credited her with reversing this cynicism. Noe inspired him to become more interested in the integration of anarchism into direct action and worker organization, resulting in his shift to anarcho-syndicalism, a model of anarchism which emphasizes labor unions as a primary force for political action. Following the start of their business partnership, they dedicated themselves more intensely to activism. Becoming increasingly dissatisfied with being part of a labor movement which scarcely interacted with actual workers, they moved into a neighborhood occupied by industrial workers, and began working to establish a presence in the labor union movement. Especially following the publication of Turning Point, Noe turned her focus from autobiographical fiction to writing about the labor movement, class issues, and the topic of organizing female laborers. During this period, she also began to look into the Russian Revolution, and wrote essays criticizing the Bolsheviks, who she saw as using revolution as a pretext for seizing power for themselves, rather than granting freedom to the workers, drawing from the criticisms levied by other anti-authoritarian socialists like Emma Goldman and Rosa Luxemburg. In 1921, Noe published The Reality of Anarchism, which argued that, far from being impossible in the real world, anarchist social principles could already be seen in practice within the villages of her home island of Kyushu. She argued that within such villages, all important decisions were made based on the opinions of the entire community, with each member getting an opportunity to share their input. Through her last works, Noe commonly tied her ideals of anarchism with her ideals surrounding relationships. In another 1921 essay primarily focused on advocating for marriages free of hierarchy and authority, she talked about a time when she'd taken a sewing machine apart to see how it worked. She found that every part served a function, but no part served as the machine's center. Through the multifaceted symbol of the sewing machine, she made an analogy to her anarchist ideal of a society in which each part had to work to achieve a goal, but no part took center stage. In another essay, she described her evolving values in romance, explaining how in her youth, she had believed that people should fully give themselves over to love in order to be happy, while later she came to view true happiness as something which could only come from living for oneself. She described her relationship with Sakai as fitting into this, with the relationship being a partnership of two independent people. She further explained how, to her and Sakai, their activist work was intrinsically tied into living for themselves. We are unable to accept that wishing for a happiness that consists of passing idle days away in comfort and safety is what true happiness is all about. It is shameful to immerse oneself in, and cling to, that mediocre happiness. And from the standpoint of the way of living that is the true one for both of us, if we were to fawn upon that kind of comfort and leisure, our true happiness would be lost forever. Noe's values remained fairly consistent throughout her life, even when she was with Tsuji and couldn't put them into words. It was primarily their application which changed. By the 1920s, she had found her ideological peers, and begun to engage in the kind of social work which Tsuji had sneered at. Finally, she felt like she was making a real difference, and she felt poised to stand in solidarity with workers as they gained class consciousness and finally acted to achieve real justice. And that just makes this next part all the worse. I have to warn you now, things are about to get rough. Noe and Sakai's stories did not end well, and it's really hard to put an optimistic spin on what happened to them. On Saturday, September 1st, 1923, a massive earthquake hit the Kanto Plain on the main Japanese island of Honshu. It struck around lunchtime when a whole lot of people had their ovens on, resulting in fires breaking out, including a massive one in Tokyo. To make things worse, all the water mains burst, making it difficult to put out the fires. Needless to say, things were bad. In the aftermath of the disaster, a dock workers' union made up mostly of ethnic Koreans organized relief efforts. Now, this particular union was a bit infamous among the Japanese authorities, as a number of its members had previously been arrested for shouting anti-colonial slogans at a May Day rally. When they saw a bunch of leftist minorities launching a well-organized relief effort, therefore, they took it badly. the military police began riding around telling civilians that Korean malcontents posed a threat to the Japanese, and that civilians had been given orders to kill any Koreans they saw. Happy to scapegoat the minorities for their woes after the earthquake, Japanese civilians began forming vigilante mobs, some at the direction of police, others merely in response to rumors, and massacring any Koreans they could find. When all was said and done, at least 6,000 people had been killed by the mobs. Koreans weren't the only victims, however. In the chaos, regional police departments used civil unrest as a pretext to round up prominent leftists and extra-legally execute them. On the 16th of September, Noe, Sakai, and Sakai's 6-year-old nephew were all arrested. Yes, they arrested the child too. There are some disagreements over exactly what happened next, as a cover-up would obscure some of the details, but what's clear is that all 3 of them were badly beaten, murdered, and their bodies were thrown into an abandoned well. When the public found out, there was an uproar over the murders, and the incident was pinned on one of the officers involved, Lieutenant Amakasu Masahiko. Amakasu was sentenced to 10 years in prison, but only 3 years later, he was released on the ascension of Emperor Hirohito to the throne, who would go on to become the head of the Manchukuo Film Association, which would produce propaganda for the Japanese Empire through the 1940s. In 1945, he commits suicide in response to the Soviet invasion of Manchuria. Noe and Sakai would become symbols for decades after their deaths, representing the repression of leftists by the brutal Japanese authorities, and the tragic loss of 2 intelligent, progressive figures who had so much more potential than they were ever able to act on. In 1969, director Yoshihige Yoshida would adapt their story into the black and white art house film Eros plus Massacre. Thank you for watching, everyone. I know it got heavy at the end there, but unfortunately that's a trend with Japanese anarchist women from this period. If you found the video interesting, informative, or entertaining, please like and subscribe, and I'll see you next time.